Thank you, Jan, for the introduction. I'm very happy and honored of being able to be the one closing our lecture series on applied cybernetics. Today is the fifth lecture of our series, and I want to thank to everybody who made that possible, particularly Professor Ernst and Professor Herman. This was a joint effort by Humboldt University and the Technical University of Berlin. And yes, well, with not further delay, please let me present you the talk I prepared for this occasion. I will read. An attempt to media-archaeologically analyze and problematize Project Cybersyn, a telecommunications network and processing system developed by Stafford Beer and his team in the early 1970s in Chile to cybernetically manage its economy, can be deployed under three interconnected movements, which I refer to as Encode, Forget, and Govern. This lecture, however, will tackle the first of those, that is, Encode. Through that, an examination on the project's early processes of modeling of production systems, the setup and usage of telecommunications infrastructure, as well as the exchange of and transmission of data and information will be developed. The aim will be to identify and discuss the possible frictions that would have arisen between the attempts to deploy and implement the techniques and technologies that serve such processes and the real concrete production activities and technological infrastructure these processes sought to model and operate in the factories and in the networks that connected them. Thus, the next 60 minutes of my talk will be structured as follows. First, I will cover the early stage of Project Cybersyn, through which a group of Chilean engineers, most of them part of the local Institute of Technological Research, INTEC, a branch of the State Development Agency, Corfo, visited and then modeled the operations of the factories the project sought to connect. It will be important to consider here the techniques used by them as well as their training in operational research. Second, I will move towards the telecommunications infrastructure used to interconnect the factories that were part of the project. I will talk of some of the protocols used to encode the data to be transmitted, and perhaps more substantially, I will go through part of the earlier history of the technical deployment in Chile that led, in more than one aspect, to a technological moment on which Cybersyn acted. Third, as an analysis of the previous 2 points, I will attempt to formulate a techno-historical and techno-epistemological problematization which, starting from Michel Foucault's archaeological approach to the notion of exchanging, interconnects operational modeling techniques, technological infrastructure and its protocols to what I call telecommunications. With this, my aim will be to start drawing a long and transversal media-theoretical thread to which the question of encoding, as well as Cybersyn's symbolic politics of transmission, can be noted. Preliminary. However, before going to that, please let me briefly summarize, assuming that some of you are not totally familiar with my case study, what Cybersyn was, as well as some general aspects of my approach to its study. The events that shape this talk begin with or go through a piece of machine-type paper written in English. On July 13, 1971, a 28-year-old engineer called Fernando Flores, who had been recently appointed by Salvador Allende's government as the technical manager of Chile's Agency of Development, Corfo, and thus also as president of the board at the country's Institute of Technological Research in Tech, sent a letter to the cybernetician Stafford Beer. There, first not only introduced to the British to the socialist changes that Chile's industrial and financial sectors were experimenting, but he also acknowledged the influence that both the book Decision and Control and the operational research methods developed by Sigma, Stafford Beer's own consultancy company, had had in his earlier career. However, more importantly, in the letter Flores emphasized the importance of implementing, I quote, scientific views on management and organization, end of quote, in Chile's process, as well as how, I quote, cybernetic thinking had become a necessity, end of quote, for such implementation. Hence, the Chilean engineer closed his letter asking Beer for advice and for his more recent writings, while he expressed his hope that Beer could one day consider traveling to Chile. The exchange then continued, following quite similar protocols. On July 29, Stafford Beer sent a machine-typed response letter to Flores, which, reinforcing the British spelling and syntax already started in Flores' missive, in whose writing, in fact, also participated the Corfo engineers Raúl Espejo, and even more actively Juan Bulnes, to secure the proper usage of the aforementioned language. Beer listed and introduced his two upcoming books, The Brain of the Firm and Platform for Change. In the letter, he explained how these new texts would connect via cybernetics to the problem Chile was facing, stated that he will attempt to send Flores a physical final copy of the first and a manuscript of the second, and asked if Chile's embassy could function as a proper channel to send the packets. In other words, to Flores' request, we replied with a confirmation message indicating the availability of the solicited information, plus a request to secure an adequate sending channel. More importantly, in this exchange, however, was Stafford Beer's request at the end of the letter asking if he, I quote, could actually play a part, end of quote, in this enterprise, because he had, as he himself stated, I quote, the most extraordinary feelings about this situation, end of quote, given that he believed that the country war, I quote, really going to do it, end of quote. To push things forward already, Beer travels to Santiago de Chile on November 1st, 1971, where he puts together a team, and thus project Cybersyn begins. In general terms, the plan consisted in connecting all the state-owned companies, some of them were taken to the public sector through methods considered polemic by some, to collect data of their operation and production on a daily basis, for then processing it in accordance to its own inner fluctuations, being thus potentially able to enhance management in both a local and national scale. This led to structure the efforts in 4 sub-projects, namely a network of telecommunications which will transmit the data, converting each of the aforementioned companies in a node. This network will later be called Cybernet. B, a central computational unit which will receive and analyze the data to forecast behaviors through statistical models. This unit will be named Cyberstrike. C, an additional computational simulation model of the economy, which will allow the government to test different possible scenarios, being called CHECO, as an acronym for Chilean economy. And finally, D, an operations and decision room, which will display the processed and analyzed data through interactive graphics controlled by physical interfaces located in the armrest of 7 strategically positioned chairs, the so-called ops room. And even though Project Cybersyn has become mostly known because of its ops room, or more specifically, by the appealing images of it that for 15 years or so have circulated through the internet, my approach to study and analyze this case differs from such a line. The reason for this is that, according to my understanding, an attempt to trace the techno-epistemological and cybernetic scope of the project requires of a focus that begins from its operational core and then goes up. In other words, a concentration that emerging from the technologies that allowed the project's processes of communication and from the hardware and software that computed, stored, and thus created the information used in the case can take us to ask about the position, role, and exchanges that humans and machines held in these events, and moreover about the, I quote, set of strategies of the relations of forces supporting and supported by certain types of knowledge, end quote. This is what would lead us to the true archaeological fibers of Project Cybersyn, and why not to say it already, to its genealogical threads too. Therefore, for this reason, my research in general terms focuses on Cybernet, the telecommunications network, and Cybersyn, the computational processing unit. Or, paraphrasing Stafford Beer, on the nerves and the brain of a way of governing, namely Project Cybersyn. More particularly, however, my aim today is to tackle the discursive and technological exchanges that configured Cybernet, the nerves, giving emphasis to the techniques of encoding, which thus will help us to trace the strategies of relations that set the ground for the emergence of a certain politics of transmission within the overall project. That said, please let me proceed. 1. Protocols. Cybernet's most early phase required to logically and quantitatively model the internal operations of the enterprises to be connected to the project. This was, of course, essential in order to achieve Cybersyn's general goal, that is to say, I quote, to install a preliminary system of information for the industrial economy that will demonstrate the main features of cybernetic management and begin to help in the task of actual decision-making by 1st March 1972. Thus, already in his first visit to Santiago, Beer projected an information system that would be based on data flows for which, accordingly, the operations on the factory's floors had to be encoded into variables and quantifiable means. For such a task, Beer requested the arrangement of a team that should include what he then called OR man, and whose professional profile should fit the following description. I quote, not USA archetype, decision and control supporter, versed in philosophy of science, biological background ideal, end quote. And even though in the course of the project this was not matched in its entirety, it was indeed matched in general, for which I believe a small digression is needed at this point. Operational research, teaching and practice was already well established in Chile by the early 1970s. Indeed, the first courses on this field began to be taught at the schools of engineering around 1957. One of the precursors of this discipline was Raúl Espinosa Bellman, an engineer and professor at the Catholic University of Chile, whom, by self-initiative and after a random finding in a bookstore while visiting the USA during the 1950s, taught himself and later introduced the first courses on operational research for students of the then Department of Industrial Engineering, and not much later renamed as Department of Industrial and Systems Engineering of the aforementioned university. Spinoza-Bellman is actually mentioned by Stafford Beer himself in one of his early reports from January 1972, when, while discussing the necessity of counting with a Chilean systems center that could act as a supporting institution for the development of Project Cybersyn, and suggesting that this could be achieved by founding a local chapter of the Society of General System Research, of which he was then the president, Beer points out that, I quote, to his astonishment, and of quote, he discovered that such a group already existed and that it had a regular, I quote, program of meetings in Santiago, and of quote, counting as one of its members Spinoza-Bellman. Moreover, such disciplinary introduction and development had already many ramifications within the initial Cybersyn team, and even before among the Corfo engineers. Many of them had studied in the School of Engineering of the Catholic University of Chile during the 1960s, and were trained in operational research by Raúl Spinoza-Bellman and others. That is the case, for example, of Fernando Flores, who, still as a young engineer working at the State Railway Company within its OR team, years before Cybersyn, worked with the British consultants that Beer's company Sigma sent to Chile, and who also, while traveling to the USA, had a random discovery in a bookstore that made him get Beer's book Decision and Control for them introduce it to his peers in Chile. Put it another way, these events and this research in general are traversed by a series of information exchanges where university teaching, engineering practices at technical enterprises, as well as random findings at bookstores, as to recall Friedrich Kittler's theories, play a significant role. Thus, closing this digression and coming back to Cybernet's process of factories operations modeling, what the Cybersyn team used to call indicators lifting, somehow suggesting that they would be literally picked up from the real in the factory's floor, it seems important to note now how the techniques used for such a process emerged or implemented and then deployed in the context of the project. An initial thread on this can be seen in some of the notes made by Stafford Beer in his first visit to Santiago. There, in a set of 10 loose pages taken from a sketchbook, one can find several quickly drawn, colorful diagrams with comments. In one of them, under title number 4, Quantification, it is possible to read the words, I quote, quantify flowcharts, end of quote, right next to a drawing which is accompanied by the comment, I quote, identify the size of chambers flow, identify bottlenecks, end of quote. This piece of paper, this document, helps us to notice the relevance that something I will call in general technical diagrammatics, and which plays an important part in chapters 11, 12, and 13 of the brain of the film, had both in Stafford Beer's thinking and in the development of Cybersyn. More particularly, the technique of quantified flowcharting would play a key and relevant role in the initial stages of the project. First, in the methodological cohesion among the engineers serving as modelers, and second, in the actual field work while studying and modeling the workflows on the enterprises. Accordingly, a later document, a thorough report produced by one of the team engineers, allows to measure the extent reached by the former aspect. Officially published through Corfo, signed by Umberto Gabella, and distributed to the team in March 1973, the 102 pages long booklet titled a quantified flowcharting technique for real-time control, constituted a rich and detailed methodological tool for those that were or will be in charge of modeling the operations of enterprises, who, as has been said, in addition, had a background in OR. Accordingly, the report declared that its aim was to support the implementation of, I quote, management techniques that would have been developed to be transformed in effective governing tools at the service of all levels of decision within the industrial apparatus, end quote. Thus, after an introduction on general flowcharting, which defined key concepts, explained its arithmetics, and gave examples of previously modeled companies, it followed an account of the scope of and specificity of the notion of quantification in the context of this technique. Hence, by acknowledging that flowcharting consisted of detecting the flows that connect the elements that dynamically form any productive system, and given that, I quote, for the implementation of this technique, such elements must be considered as black boxes, end of quote, the inclusion of quantification implied, first, to detect the variables conditioning the flows, to then measuring the ratio between their real level at a given time and their actual capacity level. This quotient would be what the team referred to as indicator. And second, graphically express just ratio in diagram to effectively and rapidly communicate the intensity of the indicator. To give a very simple example, think of any given enterprise, that is to say, a system where a productive element is capable of receiving and handling supplies equivalent to 500 units per day. Actual supply input in a given period is equivalent to an average of 280 units per day. Thus, the indicator will signal that the ratio between capacity and actuality was equivalent to 1.78. And that should be effectively represented in the flowchart drawn by the modeler. Three considerations must be taken at this point. First, that when this technique understands all the productive elements of a system as black boxes, what it does is to follow two key concepts from Stafford Beer's theories: recursion and variety. In other words, when the technique considers the elements of a system as closed subsystem containing in turn other subsystems, and thus on and on, the nature of a recursive system according to Beer. And each of those systems in the recursion must be known and supervised only by those in charge of them, following all the same principle of autonomy. The technique allows then those in charge of the general system, as well as those in charge of the subsystem, to pay attention to the interactions between elements of the supervised system only. Therefore, from the point of view of Beer's cybernetics of management, this will constitute an initial step towards filtering variety, the diversity and complexity of the system, enhancing thus autonomy and thus assuring the viability of the system. Second, and similarly, quantitatively modeling the relations, the connections between flows and elements will allow the modeler to detect bottlenecks in the system, and thus being able to select the key and more vital variables conditioning the workflow. This is particularly important for this case study because Cybersyn as a whole operated by modeling a wide range of variables, but analyzing a narrowed and selected amount of them, and thus of data, which of course marks a key difference with contemporary data processing. Third, and as reason supporting the previous considerations, on the one hand, we have that already in the book Decision and Control, Beer acknowledged that the collection and parsing of too many variables in the process of modeling an enterprise was an actual and concrete problem for the manager seeking to control the productive system, and that therefore a cybernetic of management should thus offer ways to design attenuators for such a variety. But on the other hand, an even more concrete aspect emerged when the Cybersyn team faced the real fact that they had very limited access to infrastructure, equipment, and computation capacity to implement the project. Therefore, to the scientific ideal that would demand the manager to analyze the whole wide scope of variables detected in a system, Stafford Beer and his team had to attach themselves to this quantified flowcharting technique, which, as it has been said already, emerged both from Beer's theoretical cybernetic of management and, furthermore, from the real conditions of 1970s Chile. All the above implied that the modeling of the enterprises and its factories had been a tailored-like process, where each case went through a particular analysis and thus through a specific quantified flowcharting. In other words, the OR team recognized that each factory was a system, or rather a subsystem, in its own, even if they were part of the same industrial sector branch, for example, timber industry, and that therefore it would then deliver a particular set of variables. This long and time-consuming process was by no means an automated one, and it was always developed by a human, the OR man, as it has been previously stated. He, it was always a he, visited and studied the operations of the factories, only accompanied by its training in operational research and the technique briefly explained above. In that way, and this was part of the noise that the Cybersyn team accepted, and hence something this research must consider to further analyze not only the configuration of a politics of transmission, but a politics of communication and thus of a human-machine coupling too. This process included fair degrees of subjectivity. Let's consider, for example, the case of the textile industry branch, that is, the factories producing fabrics, which then formed an important part of the economy in Chile. The modeling of such branch was in charge of Thomas Kohn, also a 28-year-old engineer, the son of a family of migrants from the Sudetenland, who had studied in a technical university in the Chilean city of Valparaiso, where he got initially acquainted with, and at the same time deeply interested in, operational research. In this case, through programming, by attending the Fortran classes given by Wolfgang Riesenkönig, a German programmer who had visited Chile to install the first Lawrence ER56 digital computer in 1962. Kohn later studied in the United States, supported by a Fulbright scholarship, getting his master's degree from the Louisiana State University, where he actually delved into operational research, statistics, and automatic control. And as Kohn himself recalls, the processing of modeling the enterprises involved visiting the factories, using the aforementioned technique of quantified flowcharting, and to several long meetings at intake, discussing the theoretical aspects that would take the operational research team to better interpret Stafford Beer's work, the technique in question, as well as its results. All a process driven by technical skills and, as Connor states, also arrogance. At this point, it seems necessary to make an additional distinction. It has been claimed, particularly in the book of the American historian of informatics, Eden Medina, but also by Stafford Beer himself in later interviews and writings, as a sort of attempt to match Cybersyn's politics of technology to the political ideology under Salvador Allende's government, that the workers from the factory's floors had participated or had been wanted to participate outside of the Cybersyn processes of modeling and the subsequent decision making. However, in what concerns the modeling of operations and its indicators, my findings suggest something different. When it comes to Cybersyn politics of transmission, that is to say, the exchange of scientific discourses, techniques, technologies, data and information, it seems every day clearer that what it was materially manifested through the sub-project Cybernet, it is also connected and at the same time traversed by fibers that transported knowledge and information running through the old protocols that configure university teaching, academic papers, scientific and technological and technical treatises and operational reports, whose carriers were finally highly technical skilled engineers only. 2. Infrastructure. Nonetheless, new protocols were of course also part of Cybernet, and they came from the field of telecommunications and more substantially from computing, being their configuration determined to a great extent by the available infrastructure and equipment. Stafford Beer was well aware years before Cybersyn of the importance and role that computation should play in operational research, as well as vice versa, and all the more in the emergence of a cybernetics of management. Because, as he himself stated in 1966, I quote, "This was the age of automatic data processing," end of quote. Accordingly, for Beer, the main goal of his cybernetic approach to management and control was literally a matter of time. In his words, I quote, "Even the most advanced countries in the world suffered from a vast lack in the receipt of economic data, and they suffered, too, from the bureaucratic time it takes to process this data towards any kind of calculation," end of quote. His thesis then was that in the developed nations there was still a lack of consciousness about the, I quote, about what, I quote, "the current state of telecommunications and the computed art," end of quote, "could do to reduce the time of analyzing economic data, which," he argued, "used to arrive with an," I quote, "average delay of 9 months," end of quote. Therefore, he insisted, moving towards real-time processing was the only way to reach an up-to-date and effective level of data analysis and thus of economic management. And this should be the road for Project Cybersyn to follow. However, Beer and his team in Chile confronted a scenario where the available technology was, in the cybernetician own words, antiquated, and the capacity to invest in new equipment was almost null due mainly to the political constraints that affected Allende's government regarding the possibilities of an international exchange of goods. Thus, despite the ideal design would have consisted of interconnecting all the companies that were part of the plan through a distributed network of teleprocessing, where each factory could have an in-house computer to process all the information that were vital for its operation management, the real events offered something quite different. By 1971, Chile had only 57 computers, being most of them mainframes heavily used either in universities or in administrative institutions such as the National Customs Service. On the other hand, being Chile then a poor country under strong political and economical pressure, buying new machines was not a real option, even that the project would consider to connect over 100 companies. Let's take into account that a mainframe computer costed between 1 and 2 million of US dollars at that time. Therefore, the team that by then knew well that the project goals required to rely on what the old Greek tele meant, was pushed to replace the word processing by the powers of transmission considered by communications. Thus, they looked to a reliable technology that by the 1970s had been used widely in the country and which accordingly counted with a robust infrastructure, namely telex networks. Before continuing on this, however, please let me introduce an nuance here, and thus recognize an aspect from Helen Medina's unpublished PhD thesis. One, she decided not to emphasize in her book Cybernetics Revolutionaries, in which I think it is important for what we'll find. Despite the antiquatedness of the local technology, as claimed by Stafford Beer, Chile experimented, not long before Cybersyn took place, what I understand was a major technological transformation. In the government that preceded Salvador Allende's, the one led by the Christian Democrat President Eduardo Frei Montalva, in which went from 1964 to 1970, key events were developed. In 1964, a national enterprise of telecommunications, Encode, was put together by the government to enhance and control the development of the telecommunications along the country. In 1967, the National Commission of Computation was created with the specific aim of advising the government on the use of computing. In 1968, a national enterprise of computation, Encode, later called Ecom, was founded by and within the government with the goal of providing computing services to all the divisions of the state. And then, in the same year, the previously mentioned Institute of Technological Research in Tech was formed. All these, along many other efforts in the same direction, were benefited by and were somehow possible thanks to foreign financial aid, such as the program of the USA called Alliance for Progress. Thus, for example, the National Enterprise of Computation acquired first an IBM 360 mainframe computer, and in 1970 another of those, as well as an IBM 36050, both models that had been released in August 1965 into the market and were sold by IBM until 1977. On the other hand, the National Enterprise of Telecommunications inherited the technical management of part of a telex network inaugurated in 1959, but heavily extended and technologically updated in 1967, which was originally developed by the State Post and Telegraph Company on top of its own and long-dated telegraph network, as well as on top of other previously existing public and private networks of the same kind. The network had its main central station in Santiago with major line connections to the city of Valparaiso in the central Pacific coast, and microwave UHF and VHF connections to Concepción in the south and La Serena in the north. And from the later two, connections to other smaller cities were set up. And from Santiago, radio HF connections were used to establish additional nodes in the farther north and south of the country. Please consider here that Chile is over 4,000 kilometers long, and that the far north and south have particularly rugged geographical conditions. And this is not the entire map of the country. Additionally, the network also had at its disposal a central of satellite links used for international communications, which was inaugurated in 1968 as the first of its kind in the continent, and it was located 100 kilometers away from Santiago. Regarding the equipment used in this network, in 1965, the government granted concessions to two foreign companies in attention to the expansion that the network will experiment a couple of years later. On the side of the machinery and technical support to build and maintain the routing stations, the chosen company was the Swedish LM Ericsson, which provided switching systems as those of the type ARB 111 and ARM 201. Now, regarding smaller equipment, it is necessary to make a new brief digression here. It has been claimed by Den Medina, as well as in other press articles, that while setting up the telex network and facing a lack of appropriate machinery for doing it, Project Cybersyn's team was lucky enough as to find hundreds of unused teleprinters in a deposit of the National Enterprise of Telecommunications. However, the claim, which goes with no formal reference, does not give any specific detail about the finding nor about the particular type of equipment it consisted of. Thus, and even though the facts of such a fortunate finding are still a missing link for my own research, in spite of having myself speculated wrongly about the sort of teleprinters involved in Cybernet in past writings, today I can offer you some clarifications. When in 1965, Chile's Ministry of Interior granted the concessions for providing teleprinting and harmonic telegraphy equipment for the public telex network of the country, the recipient was the German company Siemens. Moreover, when it comes to teleprinters in particular, the model acquired by Chile was the T100. And I can confirm that by April 1973, the National Enterprise of Telecommunications had 215 units, and the State Post and Telegraphy Company 577 units. Therefore, if the aforementioned fortunate finding actually took place, it should have been done in a deposit of the later company and not in one of the National Enterprise of Telecommunications. Or, more simply, it was never about 400 or 500 units, but of much less machines. Let's not forget that the project expected to connect 100 factories. Consequently, it is in these conditions that the Cybersyn team found the infrastructure and thus projected and configured Cybernet. It is also true that some private telecommunications companies with presence in Chile, such as the International Telephone and Telegraph Company, the ITT, secret documents exchanged with the CIA notwithstanding, could have used the British Crete teleprinters, and it is also possible that the local armed forces had used the American Teletype Corporation Model 33 ASR for their own closed telex networks. But, as it is shown by the broad use in the public sector, this is the case, for example, of the state railway company, which had its own network too, the Siemens T100 teleprinted was by far the standard in the country. Therefore, keeping that in mind, we can continue by saying that the telex network used by the team had a code system to identify the subscribers, which was formed by 5 digits referring the first 2 to the area where the subscriber was located. The first digit indicated the region. The central region received number 4, and the second one indicated the district within the region. Santiago received number 0. Thus, when a subscriber in a southern region, for example, wanted to connect with a subscriber in the district of Santiago, had to start dialing 4 and 0. The remaining 3 digits, of course, were the identifiers of the subscriber, that is to say, the teleprinter in particular. Additionally, given the increasing direct exchanges between national and international subscribers, the Chilean authorities introduced a protocol which, following the recommendations of the International Telegraph and Telephone Consultative Committee, a UN agency, gave each telex an international identifier formed by a series of 20 signals that the teleprinter should send at the beginning of a message. Then, the series was structured as follows. Let's consider now this telex message found in the Stafford Beer archive in Liverpool. In the header, we can see a series through which we can exemplify and thus better understand the structure just presented. First, we start with letters, and then we have a line break. Now, for the purpose of this small code analysis, let's jump to the 4th line, skipping the 2 red lines in the middle. Thus, we change to numbers, and we have 5 digits, a 5-digit figure, where the first 2 are 4 and 0. That means that the subscriber was from the Santiago district. Then we have a space and a shift 2 letters again. It reads Corfo, the Chilean Development Agency. After that, we have another space in the CL code. As shown in the slide, it fits the aforementioned protocol. About the first 2 letters of this code, the G and the A, they are something I still have to figure out. However, the mere fact that the code begins with letters tells something interesting. This is so because, according to a report from 1970, I found in the documentation center of the Chilean Ministry of Transport and Telecommunications, the one from which I got the information about this protocol, I quote, "The machines used in Chile, the Siemens T100 line of code, had a default feature that made them start an exchange invariably with a shift 2-letter signal. On the other hand, regarding the color coding in the text, this feature was designed to identify between ongoing messages in red and incoming ones in black. Therefore, we can see that the message from the Stafford Beer archive was in fact printed in the National Enterprise of Computation, Encode, and the black text was incoming data from the receiver subscriber, in this case, a teleprinter in Corfu. In other words, and as we see in the numbers, both sender and receiver were in Santiago. A final aspect of this particular matter can be seen in the footer of this telex message. That small cross is the so-called "Who are you" symbol, which in the telex communication process informed the identities of the parts involved in the exchange, in the image, receiver, and sender, respectively. More interesting, however, is that not all teleprinter devices used that particular cross for such indication, but only the Siemens T100, as it can be seen in these images from the machine service manual. In other words, we can confirm that the subscriber number 40506 in the National Enterprise of Computation was a Siemens teleprinter. Yet, it is important not to forget that Cybernet was configured to support a very specific goal. I quote, to install a preliminary system of information and regulation for the industrial economy, end of quote. That is to say, that beyond the technical specification of the actual network and its equipment, the data to be sent from the factories to the processing center should also have counted with proper protocols. Hence, and given that the incoming data had to match the requirements of the software suite being developed by the Cybersyn team, these protocols were designed in the offices of the National Enterprise of Computation, where the Cybersyn team was actually based. This was done paying special attention to the indicators that the OR team obtained from the process of modeling the factory's operations. And thus, the protocol consisted of a series of codes for each factory which would refer precisely to such indicators. Then, for example, for the textile sector, a code looked like this. As it can be seen, each code was formed by 22 letters, where the first 3 referred to the sector of the economy, and the following 5 indicated the name of the factory. After that, the next 12 letters showed the indicator in particular. In this case, existence polyester, or in other words, the level of stock of polyester material. And as it is, and it was presented in the previous image, Encode prepared a form, as modest as it looks, which was the sort of supporting material the people at the factories had to prepare and send their respective data. However, one question still remains. Who was sat in front of the teleprinter and typed the data? Even though I have not been able to find a proper answer to that yet, I would like to propose a preliminary conjecture. Given that it was common that the enterprises connected to the project had departments of industrial operations, led by engineers who managed the techniques and languages that the our men used to model the processes at the factories. And for example, at the textile enterprise I am investigating had indeed one, it would not be unreasonable to think that the daily values for the indicators had been collected by somebody from these departments. Nevertheless, and just because those all too modest forms were still simple sheets of paper with empty letter boxes, it would not be unrealistic either to consider that they had been filled with the old and traditional tool called pen. For later, as if Hitler theories were again pushing the close of this section, being transcribed and typed, finally in real contact with the machine by female secretaries. I quote, "And since power after the print monopolies collapse was diverted to cable and radio, to the recording of traces and electrical engineering, outdated security protocols were dropped as well." End of quote. 3. Telecommunications. Almost 100 years before Cybersyn, in January 1874, another exchange between the Chilean government and a British technology businessman took place. This would trigger a series of commercial transactions and concessions strictly ruled by the ceremoniously handwritten protocols of notaries and of the UK's and Chile's 19th century legislation, which will lead to the setup of a submarine cable to connect the Peruvian seaport of El Callao and their Chilean equivalents in Caldera and Coquimbo to the north, as well as in Valparaiso in the center. Moreover, these developments will lead to the landing of the British West Coast of America Telegraph Company Limited in Chile, with the subsequent construction of a telecommunications network that, linked to those set up by the Clark's Transandinian Telegraph Company, will connect through cable technology, or before 1876, the main ports and business centers of Chile with Europe via Buenos Aires. The reasons for such a level of technological enthusiasm and entrepreneurship in this remote corner of the world will be something long to explain in detail here. However, it can be said that they are linked to the vast existence of natural resources such as nitrates and copper in the far north, as well as coal in the near south, and the great interest of the state to exploit them with the help of foreign capitals. In other words, the early arrival of telegraph infrastructure and technologies to Chile is inextricably attached to economical exchanges. Its purpose, consequently, is to serve as a platform of communications for commercial transactions and the capital interest behind them. Therefore, a media-archaeological analysis of Cybersyn, and more particularly of Cybernet and Cybersyn, cannot avoid, in my current point of view, the way of the genealogical. That is to say, if it is possible to think and analyze Cybersyn as an apparatus, as a dispositive, one will be called to consider and thus to study, as I said earlier, the, I quote, set of strategies of the relations of forces supporting and supported by certain types of knowledge, end of quote. 4. When an eventual secretary sat in front of a Siemens teleprinter types incomprehensible long letter codes followed by dates and decimal numbers with some high hidden goal of transmitting pure economical data, what it seems to emerge is a displacement of the centrality of human understanding and subsequently a technobisteme which is invariably attached to a yet ungraspable politics of transmission. Its genealogy, however, would be undetachable from a longer history of scientific discourses, infrastructure, technology, and information exchanges. Thus, one would be pushed to ask, whose agency would have emerged then in the 1970s factories in Chile? And all the more, what in it and how has been transformed in the course of 100 years in this particular corner of the world? Hence, if it is possible to say an answer for the latter, one could point to the question of value, its formation, and the place or time where it is hosted. And then we could say with the archaeologist, I quote, "It is thus no longer a question of knowing in accordance with what mechanism kinds of wealth can represent each other and represent themselves by means of that universally representative wealth constituted by precious metal, but why objects of desire and need have to be represented and how one posits the value of one thing and why one can affirm that it is worth this or that." End of quote. But in that far and lowly room where the secretary types, who is the one that posits the value of a thing? The one that can affirm even something when all that she has at her disposal is a seemingly frenetic clacking machine, its keyboard, and a series of incomprehensible codes? Literally, then, there seems to be no one. She fades away in the machine, and thus the possibility to find a place for the formation of value, it is left adrift. And this is so perhaps because from the teleprinters through the telex network to the processing center, any place would have been replaced by sequences of time and formation by constant erasability. What this sort of archaeology cannot tell any longer could then be pointed out by cybernetic thinking. I quote, "That is to say, that cybernetics studies the flow of information around a system and the way in which that information, or in this case data, is used by the system as a means of controlling itself." End quote. In other words, data for the system and a system for that data. Does this interrelation indicate the moment and process through which a new sort of value began to be encoded and that emerges from self-regulation? And again, if we are able to study Cybersyn as a dispositive, we should bear in mind with Agamben that starting from Foucault's positivity, we can traverse the broad and complex notion of dispositive to arrive to the old Greek term oikonomia, insofar as it signifies the administration of the oikos, the whole, and more generally, management. Therefore, could we then problematize Project Cybersyn as an economy of transmission, processing, and storage of data and its encoded value, which, moreover, advances under the aim of making its own economical condition viable? All the more, is this the note of an archaeology, of its genealogy and cybernetic thinking? That which could help us to unravel the way in which this technological project of management, of a technological economy of these positions, constitutes thus a project for governing? The notion I have formulated as telecommunications, intrinsically connected to what I call cybernetics of exchange, points precisely to these questions and to the ways in which they could serve to analyze and discuss the techniques, the technologies, and the scientific discourses that interconnect, as I have attempted to show during this lecture, Cybernet and Cybersyn. Perhaps, if I am fortunate enough, all these deployments and questions could be further unfolded through other activities during next semester. But to close this presentation already, please let me add a final remark. It has been informally claimed by some commentators of Cybersyn that the project did not actually operate, that at the end it did not function. However, the evidence indicates something very different. And thus we can be sure that at least Cybernet and Cyberstrike and these images taken from the first printout of the permanent suite shows did operate, and their features were actually applied, encoding, transmitting, and processing data of about 20 factories. Now, for the moment, send to the step. Thank you very much.